My name is Mair Underwood. I'm a lecturer in the School of Social Science. I'm an anthropologist by training. Today, I want to talk to you about one aspect of my research in enhanced bodybuilding communities, the changes to their harm reduction practice as a result of the shift towards more science-based practice. But before I begin, just a little bit of a clarification how I'm using the language. I might see if I can. Oh, you're coming up as the active speaker. Can you see me?
Yeah. We can see you,
great.
and we can see your slides, so everything is all right.
Oh, great. Okay, so I don't think I need to talk much about this. In Australia, people like to use the term PED. I like IPEDs. You prefer it in Europe, so I agree with you guys. I like it because it puts image first, and as we know from the little that we know about prevalence, people who use the highest prevalence of people who use enhancement drugs tend to be recreational bodybuilders. By bodybuilder, I'm just referring to anyone who builds muscle for primarily aesthetic reasons rather than for functional reasons. And rather than talk about people who use IPEDs, which is a mouthful, I'm going to use this term enhanced bodybuilders because that's the term that they use themselves and that they prefer themselves, and it's easier to say than people who use IPEDs. But mainly because this is the term that they use to refer to themselves. And as an anthropologist, I'm all about the inside perspective. Now, I won't go into a huge amount of detail about the approach that I use to collect this data because I really want to get into what I found and to get feedback from you guys on what I'm finding. As you all know, as researchers in this area, people who use IPEDs are a hard to reach population. So what I did is, in order to overcome these difficulties of accessing them, I did what is called ethnography. Now, there's obviously huge debate about what ethnography is. Academics love to debate everything. But what I'm talking about in brief is that I participated in and observed people's daily lives over an extended period of time, watching what happens, listening to what is said, asking questions through formal and informal interviews. So I was studying people in everyday context rather than in settings designed by me as a researcher. Now, because people who use enhancement drugs congregate in their largest numbers online, this was an online ethnography through social media and forums. I created profiles on social media and forums and used them to get to know enhanced bodybuilders. Most of these communities are closed, so it took me some time to build rapport and gain their trust so that they'd let me in to these communities, and also so that they'd talk to me rather than just ignore me. As you can see, there was some playfulness in these communities. I got FBI hats photoshopped onto my head when I first joined these communities, but eventually I gained their trust. Been working specifically with enhanced bodybuilders for about 4.5 years. I've observed thousands of bodybuilders, I've spoken with hundreds, and I've had in-depth conversations with 37 enhanced bodybuilders, all male, and from the countries listed on the slide. Now, ethnographic research is not necessarily about getting a representative sample, and the guys I spoke to do not represent all people who use image and performance enhancing drugs. These enhanced bodybuilders that I tend to speak to are what Christensen and colleagues would have called the expert type. They're the most risk averse. So I don't want you to think that I'm saying all people are like the people that I'm going to describe in this presentation. All people who use IPEDs aren't like these people that I am going to describe. These expert users that tend to volunteer to speak to an anthropologist who's hanging out in their community are the ones that emphasize science, see the value of science, and therefore contribute to science by talking to me, because I'm not paying anyone. So while expert users are probably a minority, they're a very influential minority, and they're probably some of the largest sorry, my words aren't coming out right at this time of day, some of the loudest voices in online bodybuilding and enhancement communities. So when people go online looking for advice about harm reduction, these are the guys that they're usually going to find talking, these expert users that I'm going to tell you about today. So let's start with what I want to do is sort of run through the history of thought around enhancement drug use. And it all started, according to websites and blogs on bodybuilding's history, until relatively recently, bodybuilding use of enhancement drugs was based primarily on their experiential knowledge passed on by word of mouth. So they did what worked simply because it worked. There was little consideration of the physiological and pharmacological processes that informed bodybuilding success. It was just the body that was the proof that you needed to establish your authority. So as a result, this meme, bro, do you even lift, came about. You know, you could dismiss someone's opinion in bodybuilding communities, and particularly enhanced bodybuilding communities, if they didn't have a body as big as yours. So body was proof, not much discussion of the science at this stage. And I've seen some of this sort of attitude hang on. I've seen enhanced bodybuilders dismiss academics and health professionals with this kind of attitude. You know, what can you tell me? You don't even lift. Look at you. There's a good reason why bodybuilders privilege their own experiential knowledge. There's been a long-standing divide between those who use IPEDs and the scientific and health communities. Many have suggested that this divide and the general mistrust of the medical and health communities may be due to the fact that science initially denied the benefits of these drugs. Since the very first experiments with testosterone in the 19th century, claims of efficacy have been met with mistrust and dismissiveness, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. For most of the history of anabolic steroids, both the British Association of Sports Medicine and the American College of Sports Medicine denied their physiological benefits. And it must be noted that the first experiments looking at testosterone were ultimately shown to be flawed. And it took over a century for the scientific community to provide evidence of this effectiveness. And there were claims being made as late as the year 2000 that anabolic steroids were not effective. But once the academic community finally did admit what the bodybuilders had known for decades, that these drugs are effective at building muscle, it just then switched to overstating the harms of these drugs. So it was all this denial that they worked and ignorance of the fact that they worked for decades. And then when they finally admit they do work, oh, well, they're really, really, really harmful, and overstating the harms. So bodybuilders are looking at this and going, you know, what do these guys know? So they are privileging their own knowledge. Because, you know, they've been using them to great effect for decades, and they'd had publications of their pharmacological knowledge for decades, preceding the academic scientific knowledge of these drugs by a long time. As many of us would know, the athletes are often way ahead of the science when it comes to the use of these drugs. In the intermediate stage, sort of the late 1980s and to the mid-90s, bodybuilding practice was still primarily based on effectiveness, but science began to be considered in a very rudimentary manner by certain community experts. For example, Duchesne's Underground Steroid Handbook, the second edition, had dozens of references to research, but not a single citation. So there's sort of an effort to include the science, but in this really blunt way with no proper citation. However, since about the turn of the century, The increased use of the internet has facilitated the dawning of what's been termed an age of enlightenment in bodybuilding practice. There's been, as one blog said, a very clear shift in the collective mindset of strength culture. It's no longer enough to know that things work. It's become far more important to know why they work. Over the course of the past 2 decades, research has gained an almost deific status in the fitness industry. Studies are considered by many to be the final word on any issue. This age of enlightenment demanded individuals understand, or at least pretend to understand, the science behind their practice. It's now commonplace for enhanced bodybuilders to cite abstracts from the PubMed database to provide rationales for their practice. The status of experiential knowledge has lessened relative to science-based knowledge. And the meme, "Bro, do you even science?" was created initially in bodybuilding communities, and it's since spread beyond bodybuilding communities. So now credibility and trustworthiness, while still in part established through a body that demonstrates effective practice, is increasingly also established through an ability to talk the science of bodybuilding. So this shift, this age of enlightenment, and this shift towards more science-based practice in bodybuilding and fitness communities more broadly led to a dismissal of older forms of knowledge. As this blog said, the condescension aggressively applied to theories based only on observation skyrocketed and bled its way into message boards, discussion forums, and the general culture of fitness as a whole. And so it was that the term bro science came into being and was entered into the zeitgeist. And as a website said, the term bro science is typically used in a sarcastic manner. It is meant to minimize the artistic side of the iron game while elevating science above cumulative anecdotal evidence or one-off observations. A bro scientist generally derives results from trial and error, evolving a program and diet based on body feedback. They are pragmatic in nature, caring not so much about the science backing the process, but more about bottom line results. So the term bro science seems to be coined in approximately 2008, based on my internet searches. It's frequently used in a derisive manner to dismiss experiential knowledge as lacking in scientific rigor or as being bullshit. However, there's also those who recognize the importance of bro science and its inevitable place in bodybuilding practice. There is a significant lack of science that can inform enhanced bodybuilding practice, as science has generally only explored therapeutic doses of the compounds bodybuilders use in populations that require therapeutic interventions, and has never explored the polypharmacy practiced by bodybuilders. As Ian said, almost all the hormone studies are done with the elderly or the hypogonadal youth. And in non-training environments, the only folks who knew anything about hormones being used by 25 to 55-year-olds who were active were steroid users. So bro science seeks to fill the gaps in scientific knowledge. If we define science as the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence, we can see the bro scientists as developing an alternative body of science, although perhaps not as systematically as other scientists. As Stephen said, I think you can gain some scientific validity just through reviews of users if you take it at face value, the validity of what they're posting, especially with a simple testosterone-only cycle. They're so prolific and there are so many results out there that one can begin to piece together about what an appropriate dose would be for a cycle, what the ancillaries should be, what the dose of HCG is to maintain levels of pregnenolone and testicular function, those sort of things. What that information is pretty widely accepted. Those dosages are pretty consistent throughout those communities over a significant number of years. So in terms of science, no, there's not much information, but the peer-reviewed research is not all you have to rely on. As one website said, bro science at its best is solid science that has been tested in the real world by real lifters and has been personally accepted or rejected based on their own experience. Bro science is like a research lab of many individuals, each one having different abilities, genetics, and goals, all exchanging their unique individual results. So bro science could be considered a form of community science or citizen science, and thus the boundaries between bro science and science become somewhat blurred. This blurring of boundaries also occurs because of the inevitable interplay of science and anecdotal knowledge in bodybuilding practice. This interplay led one participant to define bro science for me as a practical template for bodybuilding based on a combination of the available theoretical scientific evidence, either directly or as correctly or incorrectly interpreted by third parties, and the results of self-experimentation and the experiences of others who have experimented on themselves or others before, in order to come to a working, applicable whole for purposes of training, nutrition, supplement, or IPED use, which I thought was a really neat definition. The variable quality of bro science is frequently noted by bodybuilders. While some appear to use the science in a really sophisticated manner, making reference to hundreds of scientific papers in seemingly complex treatments of this knowledge, others may be dubbed PubMed ninjas or PubMed warriors, and they're accused of using the science simplistically, failing to take account of the context, making inappropriate links from animal studies, referring to only one study in a body of knowledge and often only the abstract of that study, and having confirmation bias. As Bjorn told me, bro science is probably the best of a bad situation, trying to find legitimate sources backing anecdotes. So people will make anecdotal observations about something. They will say, this drug did this to me, this drug did that to me, and try to find an explanation based on literature, which is obviously difficult because a lot of the stuff, like tren, for example, hasn't been used in human studies. So you can only look at what it will do in cattle. And hopefully the person who is typing up a post on the Reddit board isn't talking shit, and hopefully they understand how receptor interaction will work. It's basically crossing your fingers and trying to make an educated guess based on what little empirical evidence is around the human interaction and extrapolate from animal to human for any of the more exotic compounds. I've just recently published a book chapter on trenbolone. If you're interested in that fascinating drug, I won't go into it now or else I'll talk for hours. Okay, often enhanced bodybuilders will make statements like research has shown with no citations at all. So people can't evaluate their use of the science. Thus, whilst the age of enlightenment has meant that conducting research has become an expected practice amongst bodybuilders before the use of enhancement drugs, the sources they turn to for this research vary widely. Some will do research exclusively in online forums and social media groups frequented by enhanced bodybuilders. Others will engage with the scientific literature, some in a seemingly expert manner and from a position that is backed by scientific training. Which brings me to the community experts. So just as within the scientific world, within the bro scientific world, there is much disagreement and uncertainty and many competing theories. But unlike the scientific world, individual enhanced bodybuilders tend to have vastly different levels of scientific training, ranging from absolutely none to doctorates in relevant disciplines, for example, exercise physiology, pharmacology, biochemistry, and nutrition. Given the level of uncertainty and disagreement in enhanced bodybuilding communities, most enhanced bodybuilders will turn to these community experts to make sense of it all, as they've done since before the age of enlightenment, as other academics have noticed. These days, community experts disseminate information on social media, including YouTube, and in forums. These community experts are typically veterans or established forum members with long histories of use. They may be extremely knowledgeable and have higher degrees. Others only have a general education or even a degree in an unrelated discipline. Some have no scientific or medical training at all. And many are senior members of forums just by virtue of posting frequently and for an extended period of time. There are very few of medical professionals in these forums. I've come across a few, but not many. And I've not come across anyone with a declared expertise in endocrinology. To become a community expert in enhanced bodybuilding, it has become mandatory that the individual be able to discuss the science of enhancement training and nutrition convincingly. This ability has become a key aspect of the branding of many community experts who make their living by providing coaching and consultation services. You may have seen the outing of the Liver King recently as a steroid user, and the guy that did it is one of these community experts that talks the science convincingly and has developed a bit of a reputation as a result. Now, this guy and others will declare, I don't have scientific training. These are just my views. This video should be used for entertainment purposes only and should not be a substitute for medical advice. But then they proceed to tell you what drugs to take in what combination and blah, blah, blah. I'm using all of these big words. So they sound like they've got medical training, but they don't often. They create this illusion that they are scientifically or medically trained by chucking in a lot of scientific language. And a lot of the followers fall for it, and they think that they are medically or scientifically trained, as they've told me, oh, you know, such and such, he's a medical doctor. And I've interviewed such and such, and he has no medical training at all. But he just talks convincingly and people fall for it. Individuals are specially able to gain trust if they can not only talk the science convincingly, but they have a body that demonstrates that they can put this science into practice. Community experts fill the often large gaps in the existing science. They may recommend practices with the potential to cause harm, and some suggest that they know more than qualified medical practitioners. For example, one community expert who has no medical training and whose only relevant experience is designing insulin protocols for non-diabetic bodybuilders in order to build muscle, also designs and disseminates treatment protocols for diabetes and for high blood pressure. So he has no medical training, but he's telling people how to treat their diabetes, how to treat their high blood pressure. The group he leads call themselves a cult because, as one follower stated, we blindly believe what he says, including his often vague references to the science. An ability to confidently and convincingly talk in scientific language with reference to studies or just unsubstantiated claims that research proves a certain point is often enough to convince some enhanced bodybuilders to put their health in an individual expert's hands and often pay for the privilege of doing so. Bodybuilding communities are first and foremost communities of practice. Knowledge is disseminated in these communities because it's designed to inform practice as well as to give the sharer a standing in the community and for some to increase their business. The shift towards more science-based practice has entailed numerous changes in the ideal practice of IPED use, namely a shift towards more considered, careful, and systematic use whilst monitoring health and preventing or treating side effects. That is, while steroid use, as opposed to abuse in bodybuilding, has long been conducted within ethnopharmacological parameters aimed at minimizing harm while maximizing benefits, the turn towards science-based practice has increased the number and complexity of strategies employed to reduce harm. How am I going for time? Okay. Before I begin to discuss the changes in practice, it's first necessarily to note that this is about changes in ideals of practice rather than the reality. Many community experts who advocate for this ideal practices don't necessarily follow the ideals themselves. So it's more a case of do as I say, not as I do or did. Some of these community experts are older, so they used to be reckless. Now they're much more sensible, and they're advocating for this sensible use. Some of them would have never used in the way that they advocate. This is the ideal use of IPEDs. Careful consideration first before you use. Do your research. Research was described as occurring for months or even years before beginning use. But as I said, research is quite variable when it comes to, you know, which sources and how well they can understand them. Establish a baseline, so work out where you are before you start using drugs. Include at minimum blood work, but some also recommend cancer screening and semen analysis, and possibly also the freezing of sperm before use. So this baseline provides a target for a return to normal function upon cessation of use. Next, they need to ensure the quality and sterility of the steroids and other enhancement drugs that they're using. Many would prefer to use pharmaceutical grade, but they're not accessible, or they're too expensive, or they're limited with regards variety. Often their pharmaceutical stuff is actually counterfeit anyway. Pharmaceutical gear is not as concentrated, so they have to inject a lot of oil. So as a result, for all these reasons, underground gear tends to be used. But they have strategies to try and ensure the quality and sterility. For example, this is a post that I got from one of the forums in which I conduct my research, aimed at someone who was trying to sell steroids in the forum. You'll post pictures up of your lab, your sterilization equipment, your current finished stock, your current supply of raws, all pics that have a piece of paper with today's date, and the forum name is number 1 written clearly on it. You will also tell us your general sterilization process, what you brew with for carrier, and you will answer any other questions you are presented with. So there was a policing of the gear that was sold in this particular forum. Other efforts to judge quality might be based on colour, packaging of the compound. They may use the photo library in Llewellyn's guide. They might read reviews online. They might use reagent kits. They might use LCMS or HPLC to get detailed information about the particular compound, and these tests may be posted online as sort of advertisements or reviews of particular gear. In order to test gear, they have enhanced drug users have crowdfunded their own labs to provide tests of the gear to ensure quality. Also, the people who may use blood tests to directly indicate the quality of the IPEDs. So they will have testing done before and after use and see changes in blood markers as an evidence of the quality of the gear. This is, of course, complicated by polypharmacy and variations in the gear used, etc. Poor quality control. Products may be counterfeited, so you might not be actually using the gear that you think you're getting, all of these complicating factors. But there are efforts made to judge the quality and to ensure that it is of good quality. Then use must be careful, considered, and systematic. The standard advice for a first cycle that I find online and talking to enhanced bodybuilders is 500 milligrams or less of one testosterone compound only. In subsequent cycles, you either up the dose of that compound or you use another compound. You add in another compound, but you never do both. You need to be able to see what change in your drug use is causing what change in your gains, but also the side effects, so that you can monitor and prevent harm. So, you know, obviously if you're making too many changes, you won't know what's causing the impact. So this is the advice: careful, considered, systematic use and monitoring and maintaining your health. Since this age of enlightenment, blood work has become sort of talked about as mandatory in online enhanced communities. It's become an expectation, and this is only in the last couple of decades that this has come about. Blood levels are expected to be taken before, during and after use in order to determine the effectiveness and whether any harms are being experienced or likely to be experienced if use continues. So there's a whole bunch of things that they recommend testing that I've listed on the slide. If in an online community someone complains of side effects, the standard response these days is to say, show us your blood work. If they haven't done their blood work, then they're criticised as an irresponsible user or dismissed as an idiot. Because it's hard to get blood work through health professionals in some countries, or probably most, there are private companies where enhanced bodybuilders request their blood work. And then they interpret the results and they discuss the implications for their IPED use, their ancillary drug use, phlebotomy, and other things to treat side effects themselves. So it's worked out in the community. It's sort of a bro science of harm reduction. Ancillaries and supplements, most of you know, people who use enhancement drugs often use a lot of ancillary drugs and supplements. There's a great deal of uncertainty in the community around the use of these drugs, when they should be taken, you know, should it be taken only if blood work indicates you have a need for it, or if circumstances warrant, like you're trying to conceive, or should these ancillary drugs be taken as a preventative measure? The age of enlightenment has meant that the use of ancillary drugs has become less reactive and more proactive. There obviously is a lot of room for harm here with unnecessary harm reduction practice. They can actually be causing harm by doing things that they don't need to be doing. And as Bjorn said, it goes against the minimal necessary pharmacy that most expert users would agree is the ideal. And there's a potential over-reliance on pharmaceutical harm reduction strategies when lifestyle changes could be a healthier alternative to deal with issues such as blood pressure. So there is a readiness to jump on the latest trendy ancillary rather than, you know, make some other lifestyle change. So the health maintenance of IPED use is very complex. Requires considerable expertise to navigate that. If I use this compound with this compound and all of these ancillaries, you know, what's doing what and what do I need to counter this? And it's also complicated by, you know, the polypharmacy and the fact that there is very few with actual scientific or medical training involved in the navigation of this complexity. Enhanced bodybuilders say more likely than not that they can't access help and that they're doing it on their own. They sometimes feel that they know more than health professionals, and often they do. And the science has shown that often they do. And drug workers, etc., admit that often they don't know enough to be able to help these men and women who use enhancement drugs as effectively as they could. As a result, these community-driven harm reduction services have been established. And now we're seeing community-led blood testing services, you know, vans that travel from gym to gym doing blood work for people, have services to test the quality of IPEDs, consultancy and coaching services. All of these things are becoming extremely profitable in the face of the fact that health professionals aren't providing this service, so the bodybuilding community has to do it themselves. This is also complicated by feelings of safety around these drugs. Numerous academics have noted this, this belief that side effects can be easily managed. These drugs are quite safe. There's what's been called a rhetoric of competency. A few bodybuilders seem to describe significant harm, and they describe that the harms are relatively minor and easily rectified. There's this feeling of a sense of safety in their use, and having access to information enhances this sense of safety. So they feel safe. The problem also is that harms are normalized. As Sean said to me, you'll know yourself now, having spoken to users, if you speak to them about being infertile or having testicular shutdown, some of them, they're very casual about it. They're very casual about, it's like, well, if my balls don't work, I'll just go on TRT. But you speak to a non-fitness person or a non-user about the fact that they may now be drug dependent for the rest of their lives, and they'll be like, oh, fuck, shit, they'd be devastated. We do very much normalize problems. And Sean was right. This was the sort of thing I was finding. I'll say, have you experienced any harms from your use? And they'll go, no, nothing. And then later on, they'll go, oh, yeah, my testosterone's completely shut down. It's never come back. But they don't really see that as a harm. It's very normalized. It's just an accepted part of steroid use. So they feel safe. They normalize risk and harm. They don't see the drugs themselves as risky, but see certain use practices as more or less risky. Much more willing to attribute harm to misuse rather than inherent risk of the drugs. They distinguish between use and abuse of IPEDs, and all the bodybuilders I spoke to, bar one, has said, well, I use them, I don't abuse them. And in that careful, considered, systematic way that I was talking about before. They make this distinction. It's only the people that abuse them that experience these significant harms. The problem is that this boundary between use and abuse is quite blurry and ill-defined, and it changes through time. For example, those of you that have been studying this for a while would be familiar with the fact that there's been a change in the use pattern of how these drugs are used. As Callum said, we had our accepted way of properly doing them. You do your 12, 16 weeks on cycle, then you do your PCT, your post-cycle therapies. You might take a 16-week break and you do it again. That's changed. When I first started, that was what you did. Now people do a large amount, then scale it back to a cruise dose. That's highly accepted now. 8 years ago, if you said that on an internet forum, they would crucify you. So what Callum's saying is, in the past, this continuous use of steroids, this blast and cruise, as it's become known, would have been considered abuse. Only a decade ago, it would have been considered abuse in this community. Now, it's become normalized and accepted. It emerged approximately in the 1990s, and since then, it's become quite an accepted way. There's some still older enhanced bodybuilders that are against it, but it's a fairly accepted way of using these drugs now, rather than cycling, this on and off PCT, where you lose some of your gains while you're off your cycle. You're instead blasting and cruising, continuously using. So a blast phase that's the equivalent of a cycle, followed by a cruise phase, which is called a physiological dose or a TRT dose, said to mimic the body's natural production. As a result, you're never cycling off. You don't lose the gains that you would if you cycled off. So it increases the benefits of the drug use. We don't really know how much harm this causes. It does save you using ancillary drugs to return to normal function, but we don't really know. We have a little bit of evidence to say that perhaps it's more harmful than cycling off. So to summarize, we've got this careful consideration of use. Do your research first. establish a baseline of where all your blood markers are before you, so you can return to that when you come off. You try and ensure the quality and sterility of the gear. You use it carefully in a considered and systematic manner, and you monitor and maintain your health. This is the ideal. As I said, it's not the reality, but this is the type of use that's advocated in online forums. There are numerous factors that mean that this can go out the window. One of them is muscle dysmorphia. I've just recently published a paper on this, how bodybuilding practice can turn insecurity into a full-blown body image disorder. If you're interested in that, the reference is there. So, you know, obviously when you are feeling forever small and you have body image issues that make you believe that you're small, issues of being careful and considered and systematic may go out the window. So what we've got, I think, with this age of enlightenment is a lot of opportunities for harm reduction. We can use this shift to our advantage so that the environments of IPED use are more enabling environments that reduce harm rather than risk environments that produce harm. Bodybuilders are critical of the morality of the science, but they still subscribe to the same hierarchy of evidence. Science is supplemented with bro science. There have been those in the past, academics, that have said bro science is given more credence than science, which I have not found this to be the case, and maybe it is this age of enlightenment. What I've found is wherever possible, science is given authority. If you can cite a PubMed abstract, then you do. And I haven't found that those with training are dismissed or ridiculed, as some other academics have suggested. Instead, they're venerated. And again, this might be this change to this age of enlightenment. What enhanced bodybuilders tell me is bro science is a necessity. There isn't enough science to completely inform practice, so we have to use bro science. We'd rather there be science. As Monahan said back before the turn of the century, risks and harms are tolerated out of preference rather than ignorance. So often they will know what the harms they are going to face are, and they choose to face them. They normalize some harm and they see themselves as competent and able to avoid the worst of the harm. There may be some denial going on here, but we don't really know enough about the harms and how they can be reduced, how effective what these harm strategies are, to really say, are they in denial? Are they actually causing more harm with their supposed harm reduction strategies? We don't really have any clue. What I think the important part is that we see this as an opportunity to bridge the divide. We've got a lack of understanding on both sides of the divide between science and medicine and the IPED using communities. We need to bring together the science and the bro science, because official discourses are often seen as biased and solely focused on negative effects, thus weakening their legitimacy. We need more effective health promotion that seeks to complement and reinforce the risk management that's already being practiced. We need to stop dismissing user risk management as unsophisticated, irrational, and ignorant. Instead, see the existing harm reduction as a foundation for our suggestions of harm reduction, at least as a foundation for the science to investigate what works and what doesn't. So what I see is that we need to co-produce harm reduction strategies. We must identify appropriate ways of providing credible information that will result in positive behaviour change. We need a diverse range of approaches because this group is not a heterogeneous population. We need to align the science with existing practices. Bodybuilders are already doing their own little studies. There might be N=1 studies, but they're doing them and they're comparing results online building their science base. We need to realize that harm is being caused not only by the enhancement drugs, but by overzealous and unnecessary attempts to avoid or reduce harm. We don't know enough about ancillaries and supplements and to understand, are they actually preventing harm? Are they causing more harm? We don't know enough about PCT, cycling versus blasting and cruising, these sort of things, self-phlebotomy. We don't really know enough about what's already being practiced. It's a, you know, we don't know if self-phlebotomy is needed even, but we've got people doing this very dangerous practice. Now, just to wrap it up, what I think we need to do is approach harm reduction according to the priorities of the people who use these drugs. They don't often appreciate our priorities because they don't often hold the same priorities. As I've said earlier in my career, that sometimes they don't appreciate the focus on bloodborne virus. Obviously, bloodborne virus is important, but they see it as stigmatizing, and we could perhaps focus on preventing infection in general rather than bloodborne virus specifically, and they feel that they'd be less stigmatized by that. They don't want to be seen as needle sharing junkies. Their long-term health is understudied. We need observational studies to track health outcomes. We need to understand the risks of these drugs before we can really say what's going to work and what's not. We also need to improve the bro science. They're already using the science that we produce. How can we ensure that community experts are using the science well? We need to meet them where they are, you know, as a long-standing tenet of harm reduction. There are some health professionals and scientists in the forums, but there's not enough. We need to engage and help them use the science. And finally, we need to help them with monitoring. If we can't provide health monitoring, we need to at least help them interpret the results that they get by themselves. We can question any recklessness and point to standard advice in these communities. If you come across a user who's in their first cycle using trenbolone on top of testosterone on top of DECA, you can say, well, actually, in these communities, it's recommended that you only use one testosterone to start with, so you can see where you're at and how you respond. If we can, you know, even though we don't have the science, it's probably common sense that using one compound rather than three will reduce harm and allow you to observe and treat harms in a systematic manner. So we can use some of the advice that they're already circulating in these communities, and we can steer them away from the more dangerous of the IPEDs. So what I hope I've given you is, like, while I can't tell you what of this is correct, what we should be encouraging and what we should be discouraging, because we don't have the science yet, what I'm hoping I've given you is some indication of where people who use IPEDs are coming from. If they're not the expert users themselves, they're likely to come across these sort of views in the online forums and on social media. So at least you can meet them where they are in their understanding of these drugs. So I hope that's useful to you, and I welcome questions and ideas about how to interpret what I'm finding, how to contextualize it and publish it.